The sexualized aspect of our culture is so ubiquitous that it's hard to imagine something else, or it's hard to imagine that it's even there in a sense. But like once you start breaking it apart, where there are hookup apps that like almost everyone uses for dating. The word dating is almost antiquated. It's like not really even used anymore. If a parent says like, "Oh, who are you dating?" the kid's like, "Ew," like, as though they have some kind of visceral reaction to that word. Pornography is rampant. It's everywhere. Everyone's using it. So everything from like our dating to our relationships. And I think pornography is like responsible for something like 80% of divorce, so like it's in our wedding beds, it's in our children's lives. So it's everywhere. That's one of the reasons I wanted you to come on so badly, because to appreciate where we are, we also need to look at how we got here. And so I'm excited to get into that. Before we jump into self, because you used the word self, and that's a major point in your book, I want to look at the word sexual revolution, because even me, like I struggle to even understand like if it's an event or how to even qualify the phenomenon of the sexual revolution. Right. Everyone talks about it like it's like associated with Woodstock, and some people think it's synonymous with Woodstock. And so how do you define, or how do you go about looking at the sexual revolution?
Well, I would define the sexual revolution as that massive transformation of sexual habits, customs, morality, however you want to think of it, that's taken place really since the 1960s. Now, the important thing about that is to say that in making that claim, I'm clearly aware that many, if not all, of the sexual practices which are now commonplace in our society, whether it's homosexuality, lesbianism, whatever, free love.
Yes.
All of these things have precedence in history. There's no era of history that doesn't have its broad range of sexual behaviors manifested in the culture. The difference with the sexual revolution is that those things have become mainstream and acceptable. People have always committed adultery. Once upon a time, it was considered a heinous social crime. Now it barely raises an eyebrow. People have always engaged in homosexual activity. Once upon a time, it was considered transgressive. Now it's mainstream. Once upon a time, people slept together before they got married, but it was considered transgressive. Now it's part of the mainstream culture. So when I'm talking about the sexual revolution, I'm not talking about simply the massive expansion of the way people behave sexually. What I'm talking about is the total overthrow of traditional sexual morality relative to the practices that have always gone on.
How... If you can, because you actually touched on it, which sparked some stimulation in my direction, is that how you go about maybe articulating the sexual ethic post sexual revolution, where I guess more of like a secular humanistic approach, where if it's what I feel and I'm passionate about and it doesn't hurt somebody, then it's permissible and maybe even ethical. Is that?
Yes, I think the traditional Christian approach to sexual morality would be that certain acts have an intrinsic moral status about them, that simply performing those acts is wrong or is bad. I think what we've shifted to today is the notion that, as you pointed out, as long as I'm not harming somebody, we might say, as long as what's happening is taking place between consenting adults, and nobody's being damaged or harmed by it, then it's okay. In other words, the acts themselves cease to have any intrinsic, they are amoral in some ways. They cease to have any intrinsic moral value beyond that which is given to them by the context of consent or denied consent in which they take place.
No, that's super helpful. Okay. So jumping in then to the word self, it's almost a word that people kind of take for granted, or like self-identity, or either they take for granted, or there's this there's this really big fascination right now with like psychometric systems, whether it's the Enneagram or Myers-Briggs or whatever it might be. And so there's on the one end a lot that's informing what the self is, and then on the other end it's really taken for granted when it comes to like introspection and how we inhabit culture well. And so I'd be interested then how you look at self and what you mean by self.
Well, the way I'm using the term self in the book is it's not the common sense. I mean, there's a typical way in which all human beings have always been basically aware of selfhood. You know, if we'd lived 800 years ago, I'm pretty sure that I would have known I wasn't you and you'd have known that you weren't me. There's that basic intuitive knowledge of our own self-consciousness, we might say, as being different from the self-consciousness of others around us. What I mean by self, particularly in the book, is what is it that makes me me? What is it that really constitutes me? What is it that makes me unique? What is it that makes me tick? Where does my identity lie? What do I consider to be the good life? What do I consider to be the purpose of my life? All of these things tie into this broader, richer understanding of self. And my contention in the book is that the way we understand that notion of selfhood has changed over the last 350 years in a way that perhaps didn't make the sexual revolution inevitable when we started down that path, but has certainly made the sexual revolution a coherent and logical outcome of what has gone on, if I can put it that way.
No, that's helpful. If I'm hearing you rightly, what you're saying is at the sexual revolution, it was maybe even the climactic moment where selfhood changed, or the way we understood selfhood changed, and you went back and traced some of those antecedents to find out why that happened. Because when selfhood changed, our sense of identity and maybe even what it means to be human started to shift. Yeah. Thus, our ethics, specifically our sexual ethics, how we use our bodies, have shifted so much. And that's then the focus of this book. Is that?
Yes, I mean the book sees, in broad terms, I see three specific moves in the understanding of the modern self taking place. One, first of all, there's a psychologizing of the self, and that is my inner feelings become the most important thing about me. We really see that in a thinker like Rousseau in the 18th century, particularly in the Romantics in the early 19th century. The idea that it's my feelings are most important, and of course with that other things happen as well. So happiness becomes an inner feeling of psychological contentment. The next move is the sexualizing of psychology, and here the key figure, I think, is Sigmund Freud. Freud is the man who says, human beings, we're psychological beings, and foundational to our psychology is actually our sexual desire. In other words, sexual desire becomes something that is foundational to who we are. It becomes foundational to our identity. Think about the importance of that. Today we routinely think of, we'll talk about a gay person, or we'll talk about sexual orientation, we'll talk about sexual identity. That's a kind of an odd way to talk. The ancient Greeks, homosexual practice was a standard part of ancient Greek culture. But ancient Greeks didn't typically think of themselves fundamentally in terms of their sexual desires and practices. That's something we've learned culturally over time, I think, as a result of Rousseau and the Romantics being refracted then through the Freudian sexual lens. And then in the 20th century, we have the politicization of sex, when particularly certain influential figures on the New Left come to identify political oppression with sexual repression. And therefore the fight for political liberation becomes the fight for sexual liberation, the fight for the recognition, acknowledgement of the range of our sexual desires, the range of our sexual identities. Only when they are all recognized by society can we be truly free. So sex becomes highly politicized. And that, I think, it really sets up the heady brew that has created the rather fractious and indeed volatile political culture in which we find ourselves today.